Joel and Ellie stand in a crumbling, overgrown city, cautiously surveying the desolate streets. The tense and somber mood of their post-apocalyptic world is palpable as they brace for the unknown dangers ahead. In a world where humanity's existence has been forever altered, society now struggles to survive against a threat that is no longer fully human. A fungal infection has swept across the globe, turning most of the population into dangerous and savage creatures, robbing them of their minds while leaving them physically alive. In this new world, survival depends on cunning, trust, and the ability to stay one step ahead of both the infected and the few remaining humans who are even more dangerous than the monsters themselves. Among these survivors, one man and one girl must find a way to survive together, even when everything around them threatens to tear them apart. Chapter 1. The Fall. The world before was one of bustling cities, tall skyscrapers, and interconnected lives. Joel Miller, a construction worker in his late 40s, had once lived in such a world. The outbreak came swiftly, spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a few isolated incidents soon turned into global chaos. Joel lost everything in the early days: his home, his family, his sense of security. But he survived, adapting to the harsh, broken world that followed. For 20 years, he had wandered through this post-apocalyptic landscape, hardened by the loss and driven by a fierce determination to keep going, even when the world no longer made sense. Infected humans roamed the streets, mindless creatures driven by the parasitic fungus that had overtaken their bodies. The infected were dangerous, unpredictable, and relentless. But the surviving humans were often even worse. Factions, warlords, and militias fought for control of dwindling resources, willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. One night, Joel found himself sitting in a crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of a former metropolis. The rain pounded against the shattered windows, and the distant groans of infected echoed through the abandoned streets. He sat quietly, his rifle leaning against the wall next to him, his knife sheathed at his side. He was a man who had seen too much, a man who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from further loss. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, a soft, tentative sound, barely audible over the storm. Joel's hand instinctively went to his knife as he stood and moved toward the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. Anyone showing up in the middle of the night, unannounced, was usually bad news. He slowly opened the door a crack, peering into the darkness. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was a teenage girl. She was no older than 14, with scraggly hair and a determined look in her eyes. She was holding a pistol, but her grip was unsteady. Joel stared at her for a moment, trying to assess whether she was a threat. "I need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Joel and Ellie meet for the first time in the dark warehouse, with tension and distrust filling the air. Chapter 2. The journey begins. The girl's name was Ellie. She had been traveling alone for days, escaping from a group of hostile survivors who had been hunting her. Her guardian, a woman named Marlene, had been injured in a previous encounter, leaving Ellie to fend for herself. Ellie wasn't just any survivor, she was important, though Joel didn't understand why at first. All he knew was that the girl needed help, and despite his instincts to push her away, something inside him told him that he couldn't leave her behind. The next morning, Joel and Ellie set out together, moving cautiously through the ruined city streets. Ellie's youthful energy was a stark contrast to Joel's world-weary demeanor. She asked questions, made jokes, and seemed genuinely curious about the world that had existed before the outbreak. Joel, however, wasn't interested in reminiscing about the past. For him, the only thing that mattered was survival. "You know, it wasn't always like this," Joel said as they navigated a maze of abandoned cars on a highway. "People used to be different." Ellie looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "What were they like?" Joel hesitated before answering. "Better, I guess. Or maybe we just didn't know how bad things could get." As they traveled together, Joel found himself growing attached to Ellie. Despite his best efforts to remain distant, she reminded him of his own daughter, Sarah, who had died during the early days of the outbreak. Ellie's spirit, her resilience, and her ability to find humor even in the darkest of times stirred something in Joel that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope. But hope was dangerous. In this world, hope could get you killed. Joel and Ellie traversed the abandoned highway, the eerie silence of the broken world weighing heavily on them. Chapter 3. Trust and Betrayal. The further they traveled, the more dangerous the journey became. Supplies were scarce, and both infected and hostile humans were a constant threat. Joel and Ellie had a few close calls, narrowly avoiding infected hordes and barely escaping from groups of raiders who wanted to take their supplies. But through it all, they worked together, forming an unspoken bond. One day, they encountered a group of survivors living in an old military compound. The group's leader, a man named David, welcomed them with open arms, offering food, shelter, and a place to rest. Joel was suspicious from the start. He had learned not to trust strangers, especially those who seemed too eager to help. But Ellie, tired and hungry, was more willing to accept the offer. As they settled in for the night, Joel kept his eyes on David and his people. Something about the way they moved, the way they watched him and Ellie, didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. It wasn't long before his suspicions were confirmed. In the middle of the night, Joel overheard a conversation between David and one of his men. They were planning to kill him and take Ellie. The group had been hunting people like them, desperate survivors, alone and vulnerable, for weeks, using them for food and supplies. Joel didn't hesitate. He woke Ellie and together they fled the compound, barely escaping with their lives. David and his men pursued them through the night, but Joel was relentless in his determination to protect Ellie. When they finally reached a safe distance, Joel collapsed from exhaustion, his body pushed to its limits. "I told you," Joel said, breathing heavily. "You can't trust anyone." Ellie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Except you, right?" Joel didn't answer. He didn't know if he could even trust himself. Chapter 4. The Fireflies. As the weeks passed, Joel and Ellie's journey grew more treacherous. Their destination was a city where Marlene had told them the Fireflies, a rebel group working to find a cure for the infection, were located. The Fireflies were Ellie's last hope. Marlene had believed that Ellie was immune to the infection, though Joel was skeptical. He had seen too many people die, too many promises broken, to believe in miracles. But as they neared their destination, Joel began to see Ellie differently. She wasn't just a burden or a responsibility anymore. She was a symbol of something more, a chance for redemption, for him to do something that mattered. Their arrival at the Fireflies' stronghold was bittersweet. Ellie was taken in by the group's scientists, and Joel was left alone, wondering what would happen next. It was then that he learned the truth. In order to develop a cure, they would have to perform a procedure on Ellie that would kill her. Joel was faced with an impossible choice. He could let them go through with the procedure, sacrificing Ellie for the greater good, or he could save her, condemning the world to its current state. For Joel, the choice wasn't difficult. Joel and Ellie flee through the forest at night, desperately trying to escape their armed pursuers. Chapter 5. The Last of Us. In the dead of night, Joel fought his way through the Firefly compound, determined to rescue Ellie. He killed anyone who stood in his way, leaving a trail of blood and destruction behind him. When he finally reached the operating room, Ellie was unconscious on the table, prepped for surgery. Without hesitation, Joel shot the lead surgeon and carried Ellie out of the facility. As he fled, he was confronted by Marlene, who begged him to reconsider, telling him that Ellie would have wanted to sacrifice herself for the cure. But Joel refused to listen. He couldn't lose her, not after everything they had been through. "I'm sorry," Joel said before pulling the trigger. With Ellie in his arms, Joel drove away from the Fireflies, leaving the city, and the cure, behind. As Ellie awoke in the back of the truck, groggy and disoriented, she asked what had happened. Joel lied to her, telling her that the Fireflies had found others like her and that the cure was no longer possible. Ellie was quiet, but Joel could see the doubt in her eyes. The two of them continued their journey, heading toward a future that was uncertain, but together. In the end, it wasn't about saving the world. It was about saving each other. Joel, determined to protect Ellie, carries her through the hospital hallway, escaping the Fireflies' facility. The world had changed, and so had Joel. He had started as a man who had nothing left to live for, but in Ellie, he had found a reason to keep going. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in the fires of a world that had lost its humanity. They were the last of their kind, two people struggling to survive in a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human. But as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next.